Hello.
Hello, that seems much better on my end.
It does. My Wi-Fi sometimes can be fixed by turning it on off and on again. We should think with internet it wouldn't work like that. You'd think the internet would either be working or it wouldn't.
Yep,
Um, what I'm going to do, Emma, is if it's all right with you, I'm just going to start from the beginning.
that's
Um,
fine.
because what you were talking about at the beginning was the fact that you'd been at one of the first post-COVID youth climate protests. I think that's really interesting. So if you'd mind starting off telling us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in Manchester today, we held the first Youth Strike for Climate since the start of the pandemic. So I think the last one was February 2020. So it's been about 18 months, which is crazy. But yeah, we held the first in-person one today in St. Peter's Square and around 200 to 300 people, which was definitely less than we had before. But it was just great to be able to get everyone back in the same space after so long and to do chanting, which we all love. So it was really good.
That's really amazing. And you were telling us a little bit about the energy that comes from having protests in person compared to online.
Yeah, it's just honestly, online is not the same at all. I think when you're at a protest, there's just a sense of community and united purpose and united voice. And the energy that you get from that, like the energy that I've got now, it sort of makes activism, it makes it feel not worthwhile, but it gives you energy to carry on with it because it can be really exhausting putting your energy into something and adults continue and sort of not do the thing you're asking them to. So it's just good to get that energy and realize that there's still people standing with you trying to push for the same thing.
Brilliant. And this is a weird jump, but I realised by going straight in to talk about the protest, what we've not actually done is given yourself a chance to introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Um, so would you be so kind as to introduce yourself again, due to the technical issues the first time around?
Sure. So, yeah, hi everyone. I'm Emma Greenwood. I'm a 17-year-old youth voice and climate activist. So, I helped coordinate the youth strikes in Manchester, as well as helping internationally as part of the Fridays for Future network. And I'm also the youth MP for Bury. So, a youth member of parliament is basically like a young person that helps to ensure that young people in their borough are represented both locally in decisions that council makes, but also internationally and in the UK government as well.
And my name's Rab. I'm the author of a YA fantasy book about climate change called The Landfill Mountains. And it's that book which is why I'm lucky enough to be interviewing Emma today. Um, so something you were mentioning there was that there'd been sort of challenges in terms of continuing the activism across the time of COVID-19. Could I ask you a little bit about what some of those challenges were?
Yeah, I think the biggest one was probably engagement because it's just so difficult when you're doing things online to see the outreach it's having and to see the impact. And so when you're constantly pushing things out and maybe you aren't getting that many likes because it isn't hitting the algorithm, it's sort of it makes you question why you're doing it. It can be difficult to carry on because activism isn't something that is necessarily the most sort of energy giving thing you can do. So it was just difficult to keep morale up, especially obviously during a global pandemic in itself, which is difficult to get through for anyone. And so to be back in person and to be able to do that is much needed, and I love it.
You mentioned sort of having to try and play to the algorithm. I noticed when I had a little bit of a look on your social media before joining that something you'd mentioned was sort of alternatives to social media in order to get out to people, and that there can be some difficulties around social media. Um, so I wonder, could you tell me about what some of the negatives of having to play to the algorithm are?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time, social media, especially Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, are really centered on individuals. And a lot of the time, I, as an individual activist, I don't want to uplift myself. I want to uplift the organisations and the groups and the causes I'm trying to campaign for. And just because there isn't necessarily like a person on that page heading them, they just don't seem to hit the algorithm as much. And it's disappointing to see because these people put so much time and energy into the resources they create, but they just don't get the audience they deserve. And I think that can be really disheartening for a lot of young people.
So there's something where the algorithm almost promotes the individual over kind of collective work, which environmental, I suppose, justice often falls into a collective.
Precisely, exactly.
That's really interesting. That kind of leads me into a point of, I suppose, quite personal interest for me. Is I'm really interested in how storytelling and climate justice link. I love the sort of power of storytelling. But at the same time, when it comes to climate change, people use storytelling in quite a negative way. People sometimes try and portray activists in a really negative way. Um, People sometimes try and tell a story of climate change not being a real problem or being a cyclical thing. So all these kind of, I guess, fake narratives get put out there to try and battle real change. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on the power of storytelling as an activist and what role it plays for you.
Well, I think I often see storytelling most powerfully within Indigenous tribes and Indigenous groups. Obviously, they've used storytelling for many, many generations, and I think they can see more than anyone the change that we've had in the climate because their generations are so connected and they just tell so many stories, and that's how their cultures are built. That they can see firsthand, probably before scientists ever could, the change that was happening. And there's so much power in how you portray people, but also how you and how what people you portray, because I think a lot of the time within the climate movement it can be very middle class and very white Western dominated, because they're the voices that get uplifted and they're the people that have the privilege to be able to do activism and to do these things because it is a privilege. And I think a lot of the time, if maybe people don't see themselves within climate activism, they don't either think they're included or they don't think it's accessible. So within storytelling, especially when it comes to climate activism, it's so important that people can see themselves in activists out there and that activists of different backgrounds and different diversities are uplifted, especially from like the global south and people from Indigenous groups themselves.
It's really interesting bringing up the global south specifically because I suppose that's where, as you say, climate change is having the most obvious impact now. I think one maybe dangerous story around climate change is this idea that it's a future problem. People try and place it as, oh, this is an issue that we need, we've got a ticking clock and we need to change things before it's too late is a phrase that's often used. But then that sort of excludes the people who are being harmed by it right now. So what are your thoughts on how we might make people see it as a present tense problem?
I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? And it is one of those things that the people who have the most power to do something are the ones with the most privilege and the ones that don't feel the effect. So it's a really dangerous combination. I think a lot of the time it's people in the global north choosing to give their voice and platform and just uplifting the message of people from the global south because it's just automatic that a lot of kind of news outlets or a lot of people will come to people in the global north because we're the ones that have the privilege of the biggest platform. And so it's making sure that you use your voice as much as you can to give them opportunities if you can firsthand. But if not, that you use any opportunities you get, like this one I'm speaking to you today, to ensure that their voices are there and that it just is brought to the front of people's minds. Because so often, if people don't speak about it, they will just be forgotten. And kind of their countries will just be entirely washed away without anyone ever saying anything.
Yeah, and it's that I really love that idea of promoting other people's voices and being aware that I suppose particularly in Western media we've got a tool that reaches the whole world, and social media kind of links in with that as well. Something that I'm aware we were speaking about before we started having technical issues that feels like quite an important issue to touch on is how activists can look after their own mental health, because these issues that you're facing, in terms of, obviously right now we're talking about global problems, and talk about trying to, earlier you mentioned about trying to get adults to take it seriously. These are the kind of things that can have a toll on mental health. Um, so how do you as an activist look after your own mental health? And would you have any suggestions for others in terms of how they could look after their well-being?
Yeah. So I'd love to say that I've got the activism mental health thing nailed down, but I definitely haven't. It's so easy as an activist when you kind of just see so much bad happening in the world, and especially with the climate crisis when you see it progressing. You just want to put all of your time and energy into fighting. But the problem is that obviously we're young people, a lot of us that are doing this, and we're still in full-time education and we're doing other things and we're sort of just growing up as a whole, and in itself is a difficult thing. And so there is so much there's a lot of burnout culture in activism, which is really, really dangerous. And I think the one thing that helps activists is the network that they have around them, because we're all in the same position, we're all fighting for the same thing, we all pretty much feel the same emotions and experiences, and we all kind of have burnt out at some point. and there's a great network either supporting you if you need it, and there's always people there to message. And I think we're really open. There isn't a stigma around mental health in the activism community, which I think is really good. But also that we check each other and we go, I've seen that you've been doing loads recently. Maybe you need to take a step back or not come to meetings this weekend. And I think we're good at kind of being open to people telling us that, but also being aware of those around us and making sure we look after each other. Because in the end, we can't fight for the planet if we're too burnt out to do anything. And so we've sort of built that into the culture we've got. And I think it's definitely still something that needs improving, but it's something we're quite good at implementing.
It's really interesting how, in that way, your climate activism is sort of linking with another form of social change. Um, because I guess young people talk about mental health now as a massive thing because for so many generations, mental health not being spoken about has had really um, atrocious impacts on people. Whereas actually fostering a kind of open approach to speak about emotions makes such a difference. I wonder if there's any other ways where you've noticed that climate activism kind of links with other social change.
Um, I think a big one is probably LGBTQ plus rights. I honestly at strikes, everyone. I think everyone feels. I do myself anyway. Feels so accepted and so included because a lot of other things just don't matter. I think the only thing that matters is that you're there and that you're passionate and that you want to see change happen. And so within that community in itself, nothing else really matters. And I think it's just for a lot of people, it makes them feel heard because a lot of the maybe the kind of social biases or the prejudices that we have are sort of gone there. And I think it's just really rejuvenating to see, and that's why I think people come out of a strike feeling so invigorated because they've just been a collective. And when you're part of something, I think it's so much easier to feel like you're less different in a bad way, if you know what I mean. And the culture that's created, I think, has been a really supporting thing, whether that is for LGBTQ plus rights, of feminism and men and women and all that sort of stuff. I think it's helped people feel as one in that sense.
And something that you mentioned earlier that I was really interested in touching upon as well was you mentioned sometimes one of the things that can be difficult for mental health is trying to get this message to adults and not getting that response and not getting the reaction that you want. And often there can be a very condescending response from adults towards youth climate change activists. I mean, what gets said most in the media is people's different responses to Greta Thunberg and from people, taking swipes at her Asperger's or taking swipes at how she speaks or all sorts of really juvenile things you see from adults towards a teenager. And I wonder, how do you sort of deal with and respond to those condescending and kind of patronizing responses that youth climate activism can sometimes generate?
I think it is really difficult because in the end we are young people that are still trying to grow up and figure out who we are. And I think a lot of adults somehow fail to understand that they were, imagine them being 17 and somebody telling them that they probably weren't so self-assured as some of them try and seem to be now. So it isn't something that's easy for us, especially I can imagine for Greta. Um, but I think a lot of the time, again, it's having that support network because it is sometimes you get knocked back if you read something like, I know on Facebook posts predominantly, if you read the comment section in that, it's very easy to fall down a deep, dark rabbit hole. But I think it's having that network around just to reassure you that what you're doing is good and it's having a positive impact. And there's always going to be people that disagree with you. And that's just, I suppose, the world we live in. But it's reminding yourself that what you're doing is having a good impact and you're fighting for something that needs to be brought awareness to. And I think having the support of adults and having the support of adult allies, people like you who are interviewing youth activists like me, that in itself reminds you that what we're doing is good and we have people supporting us, and you have to sort of within yourself amplify those more positive and more proactive voices and push the other ones down.
Well, that leads me on to a question I was quite keen to ask actually, which was what can adults who see youth climate activists and feel inspired by yourselves and what you're doing, what can adults do to best help? What's the best way for adults to be positive and helpful towards youth climate activists?
I think one I'd say is use your voice. Adults have the power to vote, which so I'm 17 at the moment, I'm 18 in December. And for me, the thought of voting is so exciting. Like you have the power to physically shape the entire policy decisions of the country. like adults, the power you have to vote, I think it's so easy to go apathetic with it. But honestly, go out and use it and research who you're voting for and vote for the person that you think will be best. But just go out and use your voice and promote other people to vote as well. And maybe obviously we can't always vote because general elections don't happen that often. But go into community organisations as well and community groups. I think the biggest power we have is as collectives. And I've always found that when I join different groups, I meet different people, there's so much power when we bring our voices together. And I think at the moment that's sort of underutilized. So if you can find, even if it's like a local community group, whether it's something online that you want to join, anything like that can just play a huge role in supporting the work that we as young people are doing.
There's an interesting sort of thread that's come through this interview of that idea of the collective and the power of it. And one question I'd intended to ask was about sort of your individual journeys, how you got into activism. But I suppose, having had this conversation, I want to hear about how that links with the collectives that you've become involved with. So I guess, can I ask a little bit about what inspired you to get into activism, but then also how that led you to become part of wider groups?
Yeah, so I got involved. Everything sort of started February 2019. So I was elected as youth MP and I went to the first youth strike in the same month. So that was sort of like my starting point. But what inspired me to get there was, I think, maybe not inspired me, but more pushed me to. We're seeing like the Winter Hill fires that we had near me. You may have seen them on the news, but also the Boxing Day floods that just in the village down below me basically washed away a whole pub, which was just really scary. I think at the time I was 14, 15. And I think seeing the extent of that damage and seeing how quickly kind of a beautiful green space I absolutely love can just be completely taken away and burned to a crisp, it was scary. And then seeing the lack of media and government response to that was even scarier because I'm like, why isn't everyone panicking? Like, why isn't this being picked up? And so I think that sort of motivated me to go, wow, adults aren't going to do this on their own. Like, I have to raise my voice. I can't wait until I'm 18 or wait until I'm older and I've got a degree to do this. It needs to be done now. And so I saw the youth strike advertised on Facebook on like a little Facebook event, and so I was like, oh, I'll go. Why not? I'll take the jump. So I emailed my school and I was like, I'm not coming in. This is why I'm doing it, and explained it. And I went, and I just don't think I've ever experienced anything quite like it. Where I went and I just felt so. I've never felt more accepted within a group, and never felt like I was more amongst people that are like myself. And that one strike, it wasn't the biggest one, but there was just so much power in people's voices, and there were people who at the start of the strike were like, oh, I could never public speak, but by the end of it we're up on the stage chanting. And I think it's the atmosphere that it created of confidence, acceptance, unity and passion. I think it was just so energizing, and from there I've helped coordinate youth strikes, and it's grown very quickly.
There's a bit of an idea at the moment that the right to protest might be under threat. Um, we've seen a bit around that in the news. And I wondered what your thoughts were in terms of sort of both the importance of protest and how to protect that right.
Yeah, so the basically the police and crimes bill at the moment is the thing that's threatening the right to protest, because things like excessive noise, whatever that means, it's very loose definition, could be arrestable. So things like us chanting, which we absolutely love to do, and it invigorates a crowd and it allows us to uplift each other, that could be made illegal. And that is really scary because as young people, as I said, we can't vote. The only power that I have is to strike off school, because education is the only thing I'm mandatorily supposed to do. And so I think without that, it just creates a sense of powerlessness, but it also reduces accountability on the government, which in the democracy we have is a really, really key aspect of it. And it's scary because the government need accountability. Absolutely any government, no matter what party they are, deserve to be held to account by the people voting to them and the people in their country. And the thought that we couldn't do that is very scary as a young person. The thought that the government can take that away is even scarier.
The idea that people would support that right to hold a government to account in itself feels bizarre, and it feels like it takes quite a propaganda exercise to then convince people to voluntarily give up their right to say no, actually this isn't okay.
Yeah.
Something I wanted just out of the story you just told was, obviously you mentioned during the school strikes. How did the school react to you explaining why you were going to take the time off?
I think I was quite lucky. My school was relatively positive. So the first one, they were really positive. They were like, I think they were quite excited by it and the thought of it because youth strikes that was the first time they'd done it. So no school had ever really experienced it, and they definitely never had a student emailing going, "Oh, I'm going on a strike." And I think they were just a bit shocked that somebody in like year 9 was doing that. So I think I was really supportive. But I think as it went on, it became harder because I got higher up in school, so obviously year 11 and things like lessons started counting more. But I don't think they fully understood maybe the passion that I had and the reason why I had to keep doing it. And they were like, "Oh, why are you still fighting? Like you've done it a few times, pack it in now." You know, they never said it, but it just felt like that was the attitude they were portraying to me.
Mm.
And so it got harder, and I carried on going. Obviously, I just thought it was something for me, but it definitely got more difficult as the strikes went on.
It's that question of why you're still doing it. It's like, well, the environment's in a slightly worse place over those years rather than a better place. So until
Exactly.
it's the other way around. Um, Something that I'd be interested to hear would be what would you say to, because already now you mentioned being in year 9 when you started striking. There's people younger than you that might be hearing people like yourself speak and be inspired to get involved and start acting on the climate. What would your message be for people younger than yourself?
I just say go out and do it. Your power as a young person holds so much voice because adults just don't expect us to stand up and to use our voice and to take a stand and to be informed about stuff like this. So when you do, and I've been to council meetings, people just look at you a bit concerned. And then when you speak and they suddenly go, "Oh my God, she actually knows what she's talking about," they're even more shocked. And so you speaking holds so much more power than maybe an adult counterpart doing it. And so go and make a space for yourselves in those spaces, whether that's council meetings, whether that's local environmental groups that are maybe really adult dominated. But know that your voice has power and you don't need to have a degree in environmental science to be able to speak on the climate crisis because it's something that we're all living. And by living it, it's something you have experience in and there's something that you have the right to speak about. And I think for so many young people, it's that bit of just not feeling adequate enough or not feeling like you know enough or not feeling old enough, but that should not be a barrier because when young people enter a space and they input their voice into it, it instantly becomes better. So just take that leap and do it, and I promise you good things will come.
I'd almost argue that if you wait till you feel you know enough or you feel you're old enough for your voice to count, then you might never feel like you're at that stage where you've got 100% of the knowledge you need. It almost feels like if you can get past those reasons to not do something. I wanted to ask just a sort of final question here, and then I would like to hear about any causes that you'd like to promote. But I was interested to hear you mentioned being a youth MP, and I wondered how that's related to your sort of activism around climate change and how that's allowed you to take action. I was just interested in what you've been able to do in that role.
Yes, I think my youth MP, I think the title in itself has been a huge role because it's allowed me to access so many opportunities of people wanting
Mm.
to engage young people but not really knowing how because I think they're a bit scared that either they can't speak to them correctly or they're scared young people just won't know what they're talking about, which isn't true. But I think a lot of the time the titles just help me to gain those opportunities and to help create spaces in really adult dominated areas that other young people can come into in the future after me, hopefully. Um, and yeah, it's just allowed me to help bridge those gaps between the generations, which is so important if we want to take climate action. Because however much the government push, the climate crisis isn't something that Gen Z or my generation can solve. It's something that we need adults to solve. Because if they wait for us to do it, we've got nobody else to push it on back to. So we're like the last line, and we shouldn't get to that point. We need adults to do it, but we need to work together to do that. And we need young people, especially those in the global south, to be included in those conversations. But working together is so important. I think through the role of the youth MP, I've helped to facilitate that a bit.
Brilliant. And so just on to a final question, just is there any causes or organisations you think are worth giving a shout out to or are worth giving a bit of detail around?
Yeah, so FFF MAPA is the biggest one that I'd probably say. So MAPA stands for Most Affected Places and Areas. So that's
Mm.
basically the acronym we use for the Global South. So it's people who are most affected by the climate crisis, but probably have the most kind of powerless or least amplified voice out there. And so if you go and follow them and just make sure you can do everything you can to uplift the work they're doing, uplift their messages, and they post a lot about natural disasters that maybe aren't covered in the mainstream media in places like the UK. So that's, yeah, definitely one to go and check out. And then Youth Strike for Climate Manchester as well, which is the youth strike that I helped to coordinate today. We're a great group. We'd love to have people come and volunteer and attend strikes, and we'd love to have people in the future. And if you do want to attend a strike and want to find your most kind of local one, on the Fridays for Future website, there's a nice little map function which has strikes from all around the world, so you can find your closest one to you and go along. People are so nice there, and there's always so much empowerment and so much acceptance. So don't be afraid. Just yeah, head out there.
That's wonderful. And what a wonderful two organisations. I'll definitely be having a look at both of them myself. Well, thank you very much for talking to me, Emma.
Thank you for having me.
Brilliant. Have a lovely rest of your evening.
Thank you, you too. Bye.
And thank you for everyone listening as well.